JD Vance just cornered Nancy Pelosi on live television, exposing a $280 million secret that shattered a 37-year political empire. She had been in Congress longer than he had been alive. She was worth $280 million. He had grown up without running water on some nights. She thought she would teach the hillbilly a lesson. The hillbilly had other plans. "You are not qualified to question me. You are not qualified to carry my briefcase." Nancy Pelosi was standing at the witness table in the Senate hearing room, pointing directly at JD Vance. Her voice carried the ice-cold authority of a woman who had destroyed political careers for 37 years. Ivory Armani suit, pearl necklace, 84 years old, and she looked like she was about to make a 41-year-old vice president cry on national television. "I have served in Congress since before you were old enough to drive a car," she continued, each word a hammer strike. "I have passed more legislation than you have read. I have impeached a president twice, and frankly, I find it beneath the dignity of this institution that a man with 2 years of Senate experience presumes to sit in that chair and question someone with 37. The gallery was packed with K Street lobbyists in silk ties, the kind of people who didn't cheer, didn't hold signs, and didn't work for free. They nodded in unison, professional and approving. 2 CNN correspondents exchanged glances. One silently mouthed to the other, "She is going to eat him alive." Nobody had expected Vance to be here. The hearing was on the Honest Act, the bill to ban congressional stock trading. Pelosi had come voluntarily, prepared to face Senate committee members. But 30 minutes before the gavel, JD Vance, Vice President of the United States, President of the Senate, had invoked his constitutional authority to preside personally. Pelosi's legal team, 2 attorneys from Williams and Connolly, and a former SEC enforcement specialist, had not prepared for this. Nobody had. Pelosi didn't care. She had stared down presidents. A hillbilly from Ohio was not going to rattle her. "Let's talk about your qualifications, Mr. Vice President," she said, twisting the knife. "In 2016, you called President Trump cultural heroin. You compared him to Adolf Hitler, and then, when the political winds shifted, you became his most loyal supporter. That is not evolution. That is careerism." She turned slightly toward the cameras. "And let's not forget your charming observation that the Democratic Party is run by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives. You said that about women on national television, and now you sit in that chair presuming to lecture me about ethics?" Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow hit harder than shouting. "So, ask your little questions, Mr. Vice President, and then I have actual legislation to attend to." JD Vance sat in the chairman's seat throughout this entire performance with the stillness of a man who had learned patience in a place where impatience got people killed. 41 years old, simple dark blue suit, off the rack. No cufflinks, no pocket square, no performance. In front of him sat a laptop and a leather notebook. When Pelosi finished, the room waited for him to flinch, to stammer, to show the nervousness that the youngest vice president in 70 years should show when the most powerful woman in congressional history had just publicly gutted him. Vance didn't flinch. He opened the laptop, typed something, and looked up. "Thank you, Madam Speaker. You mentioned my background. You are right. I don't have your experience." His voice was flat, Ohio accent. No charm, no warmth. The voice of a man who had grown up watching people lie and had learned to spot it the way other people spot weather. "But I think my background is exactly why I should be the one asking these questions. Because where I come from, when somebody puts in $6 million and takes out $280 million, we don't call that investing." He tapped the laptop. "We call the police." Vance didn't reach for documents. He turned the laptop screen toward the committee's display system. A financial disclosure appeared on every monitor in the hearing room, the same disclosure available on government websites, now 12 feet tall and impossible to ignore. "Let me tell the committee about where I come from," Vance said, "because it is relevant to what I am about to show you." His voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. It was the flattest, most controlled voice the hearing room had ever heard, and that control was more unsettling than anger. "I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My mother was addicted to heroin. My father left before I learned to ride a bike. There were nights we didn't have hot water. My grandmother, Mama, raised me. She owned 19 handguns and didn't have a college degree. She worked her whole life and died without enough money to pay her last hospital bill." He didn't pause for sympathy. He didn't want it. "I enlisted in the Marines at 18 because it was the only way out. I went to Iraq. I came back. I got into Ohio State on the GI Bill. I got into Yale Law School and felt like an alien every single day. I tell you this not to ask for pity. I tell you this because it is the lens through which I see numbers." He pointed to the screen. 1,987. The Madam Speaker enters Congress. Financial disclosure shows a portfolio worth approximately $700,000. He tapped the keyboard. A second disclosure appeared next to the first. 2025. The same portfolio, now estimated at $280 million. He let the two numbers sit side by side. 700,000. 280 million. Congressional salary. $174,000 a year. 37 years. Total gross income, $6.4 million. After taxes, rent in 2 cities, living expenses. Maybe you save $2 million, maybe 3. If you never go on vacation. He looked at Pelosi. But the disclosure says $280 million. So where did the other $277 million come from? He didn't wait for an answer. "My grandmother worked her entire life. She never made more than $30,000 a year. $280 million is 9,000. 300 years of her salary. 9,300 years. She would have had to start working before the pyramids were built to earn what you have accumulated in 37 years on a government paycheck." He turned to the committee. "The Madam Speaker says this is all her husband's doing. He is a private investor. He makes his own decisions. She has nothing to do with it." He looked back at Pelosi. "You have been married for 61 years. You live in the same house. You eat at the same table. You share the same life. And you want America to believe that in 37 years, you never once mentioned what was happening in the committees where you were the most powerful person in the room?" Pelosi's voice was razor wire. "My husband's investment decisions are his own. I have stated this publicly, privately, and under oath. And I would remind the Vice President that accusations require evidence." "Evidence?" Vance repeated. He turned back to the laptop. "Let's talk about evidence." He clicked. A new document filled the screens. This is an email from Paul Pelosi to his broker at Wells Fargo, dated June 17, 2022, obtained through a Senate subpoena issued 3 weeks ago. The room went dead silent. Vance read, "Nancy says the semiconductor package will clear committee by end of month. She is confident on the floor vote. Move on. The NVIDIA calls before the announcement. Use the Delaware account." The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the fluorescent lights sounded like a jet engine. "Nancy says," Vance repeated. "Nancy says the semiconductor package will clear committee. Not, I think. Not, the market suggests. Nancy says." He looked at Pelosi. Her face had not changed. The composure of 37 years in Washington held. But her lead attorney's hand had stopped moving on his legal pad, his pen frozen mid-word. "You stated under oath that you had no involvement in your husband's trading decisions," Vance said. "This email suggests your husband disagrees." Pelosi's SEC attorney stood. "Mr. Vice President, the authenticity of that document has not been. It was produced under a lawful Senate subpoena from Wells Fargo's own servers," Vance said, not looking at the lawyer. "Date stamped. IP verified. If you would like to challenge its authenticity, you are welcome to do so in federal court under penalty of perjury." The attorney sat down. "But that's just one email," Vance continued. "Let's look at the pattern." Vance didn't pause between sections. He didn't take a sip of water. He didn't adjust his glasses. He didn't wear glasses. He moved from one piece of evidence to the next, with the efficiency of a man who had been trained by the Marine Corps to complete objectives without wasted motion. Trade number 1, NVIDIA and the CHIPS Act. A timeline appeared on every screen. Dates, amounts, legislation, all mapped in parallel. July 2021. Paul Pelosi purchases 5,000 shares of NVIDIA. June 2022. He buys call options for 20,000 additional shares. At this time, the CHIPS and Science Act, $52 billion in semiconductor subsidies, is being written in the House under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi. He traced the timeline with his finger. "The email I just read is dated during this period. Nancy says the semiconductor package will clear committee. And her husband is buying NVIDIA, the single largest beneficiary of that legislation." He clicked to the next slide. July 2022. CNN starts asking questions. Reddit threads explode. Paul Pelosi panic sells all 25,000 shares at a loss. $341,000. He looked at the committee. The greatest congressional investor in history sold at a loss. Why? Because the cameras turned on. Not because the investment thesis changed. NVIDIA went on to become the most valuable company on earth. He sold because he got caught. He clicked again. December 2023. The press has moved on. 15 months of silence. Paul Pelosi buys back into NVIDIA. Bigger this time. 50,000 shares through call options. $1.8 million premium. By mid-2025, that position is worth over $7.2 million, a $5 million profit. Vance looked at Pelosi. Sold when watched, bought when unwatched. In the Marines, we call that a tactical retreat, followed by a counterattack. On Wall Street, they call it a pattern of informed trading. In a courtroom, they call it evidence. Pelosi didn't respond. Her SEC attorney was writing so fast, his pen was tearing the paper. Trade number 2. A new timeline appeared. Visa, 2024. Paul Pelosi sells 2,000 shares, $525,000. He let the number sit. Then he clicked forward on the timeline. A red marker appeared 3 months after the sale. 3 months later, the Department of Justice files an antitrust monopoly lawsuit against Visa. The stock drops immediately. Anyone who held shares through the announcement lost money. He looked at the committee. Paul Pelosi didn't hold shares through the announcement. He had sold 3 months earlier. $525,000 safely in the bank before the bad news hit. He paused for exactly 1 second. DOJ antitrust lawsuits don't appear out of thin air. They take months, sometimes years, of internal preparation. Prosecutors build the case. Lawyers review evidence. Senior DOJ officials are briefed, and the Speaker of the House, who meets regularly with the Attorney General, who attends briefings on department priorities, who sits in rooms where the direction of federal enforcement is discussed. She would have no idea that a major antitrust action was coming against a company her husband held stock in. He shook his head slowly. I grew up in a small town. We didn't have much, but we had common sense. And common sense says somebody tipped somebody off. A Democratic aide in the back row of the gallery stood up and quietly left. She didn't come back. Trade number 3. Microsoft. July 2024. Paul Pelosi sells 5,000 shares of Microsoft for approximately $2.2 million. A few months later, the Federal Trade Commission announces an antitrust investigation into Microsoft. The stock takes a hit. Vance clicked to a side-by-side comparison. All 3 trades arranged in parallel columns. Sale date, negative government action, time gap. The pattern was visual now, impossible to miss on the 12-foot screens. NVIDIA bought before government subsidy. Visa sold before government lawsuit. Microsoft sold before government investigation. 3 trades. 3 times the Pelosi household was on the right side of government action that nobody outside Washington could have predicted. He let the 3 columns sit on the screen for 5 full seconds. Then he clicked. Trade number 4. And this is the one that should scare every retail investor in America. A new slide appeared. Tempest AI. January 2025. The Pelosi household buys call options in a healthcare artificial intelligence company that most of Wall Street has never heard of. Not NVIDIA, not Google, not any company that a normal investor would find on their own. Tempest AI. A small company, an obscure company. A company that, at the time of purchase, had almost no analyst coverage. He paused. Weeks later, Tempest signs a $200 million deal with AstraZeneca. The stock doubles. The Pelosi household makes millions. He turned off the timeline and looked directly at Pelosi. How did you find Tempest AI, Madam Speaker? What research led your husband to a company that hedge funds with billion-dollar research budgets hadn't noticed? What newsletter? What analyst report? What tip? He didn't wait for an answer. He knew one wasn't coming. Because I'll tell you what I think happened. I think someone in a position to know about healthcare industry deals. Someone who attends briefings on pharmaceutical regulation. Someone who sits on committees that oversee FDA approvals and healthcare policy mentioned something at the dinner table. And the next morning, the call options were purchased. Vance turned off the timeline and looked directly at Pelosi. 4 trades, 4 perfect outcomes. NVIDIA bought before CHIPS Act, sold when caught, bought back when nobody was looking. Visa sold before DOJ lawsuit. Microsoft sold before FTC investigation. Tempest AI bought before a deal nobody outside a boardroom saw coming. He leaned forward. And in law, when the same person has perfect timing on 4 consecutive trades in industries directly affected by government action, that's not luck. That's not even suspicious. That is probable cause. Pelosi leaned into her microphone. Her voice was not defensive. It was lethal. The voice of a woman who had personally ended the careers of men twice Vance's age without losing a minute of sleep. Mr. Vice President, you are 41 years old. I have been in public service since before you were born. You are sitting in that chair on live television, accusing me of federal crimes based on one unverified email and circumstantial timing. I want to be very clear about what happens next. She locked eyes with him. I have destroyed political careers that were older and stronger than yours. I have buried men who thought they could challenge me and watched their ambitions turn to dust. So I would think very carefully about your next words. Because I promise you, there will be consequences. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. This was not an idle threat. This was Nancy Pelosi, the woman who had removed committee chairs, blocked legislation, redirected billions in funding, and reshaped the political map of the United States through sheer force of will. When she promised consequences, she delivered. Vance held her gaze. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The room held its breath. Then he spoke quietly, without a trace of fear. Madam Speaker, I served in Fallujah. I've had people point actual weapons at me. With all due respect, I am not intimidated by a woman with a gavel. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God." Vance continued without breaking eye contact. And I notice you didn't say the email was fake. You threatened me. You promised consequences. But you didn't say it was fake. Pelosi's mouth opened, closed. For the first time in the hearing, for the first time anyone in Washington could remember, Nancy Pelosi had no immediate response. Let's continue, Vance said, turning back to his laptop. Because the email is the appetizer. The main course is coming. Vance pulled up an audio file on his laptop. Before I play this, I want to give the committee context. In 2021, when there was overwhelming bipartisan support for banning congressional stock trading, 76% of Americans supported a ban. The Madam Speaker was asked directly whether members of Congress should be prohibited from trading stocks. He played a clip. Pelosi's own voice filled the hearing room. We are a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that. Vance let her words echo. Free market. That's what you called it. A free market. Madam Speaker, in a free market, all participants have the same information. That's what makes it free. When the Speaker of the House trades stocks in industries she's writing legislation for, that's not a free market. That's a rigged market. And you are the one who rigged it. He pulled up another file. But I have something better than that clip. This is from a private fundraiser in Napa Valley, November 2022. One of the donors in attendance was so disturbed by what was said that they recorded it and provided it to investigators last month. He pressed play. Pelosi's voice filled the room again. But this time, it was raw, unguarded. The voice of a woman who believed she was among friends and would never be heard by anyone else. The Stock Act? Please. $200 fine? That's not even a rounding error. My husband makes that in the time it takes to pour a glass of wine. And now these children want to ban us from trading entirely? Over my dead body. I didn't spend 30 years building this operation to hand it over because some 26-year-old with a Twitter account thinks it's unfair. The hearing room erupted. Pelosi's lead attorney was on his feet immediately. That recording is inadmissible. It was obtained without consent, in a two-party consent state. This isn't a trial, Counselor, Vance said. This is a Senate hearing, and the American people just heard your client call the insider trading penalty not even a rounding error, and describe her stock trading operation as something she built over 30 years. He turned to Pelosi. You said operation. Your word, not mine. Operation. That's how you described your family's trading activity. Not my husband's hobby. Not independent investment decisions. Operation. An operation you built over 30 years. Pelosi's composure held, barely. But something around her eyes had changed. A tightness. A narrowing. The look of a woman who had just heard her own voice betray her. That recording is taken completely out of context. Then please, provide the context, Vance said. Tell us what you meant by operation. Tell us what you meant by over my dead body. Tell us why a $200 fine for violating the disclosure law is, in your words, not even a rounding error. Because from where I sit, it sounds like you've been running an insider trading operation for decades and laughing about it at fundraisers. He didn't wait for an answer. He clicked to the next slide. The Stock Act. Signed in 2012. You voted for it. It requires disclosure of trades within 45 days. The penalty for late disclosure? $200. You made $4.7 million in a single day last year. The fine for not telling anyone is $200. He looked at the committee. That's not a law. That's a joke. And the Madam Speaker, who had the power to strengthen it for over a decade, made sure it stayed a joke. He pulled up the bill. Senator Hawley introduced a bill to ban congressional stock trading. He originally named it the Pelosi Act, preventing elected leaders from owning securities and investments. They named the anti-corruption bill after you, Madam Speaker, not as an honor, as a diagnosis. At the State of the Union, when President Trump called for a ban on congressional insider trading, Elizabeth Warren, your colleague, your ally, a Democrat, gave a standing ovation. He paused. She stood. You sat. The whole country saw it. Pelosi's voice was tight. Both parties trade stocks. Republicans trade stocks. If you want reform, I do want reform, Vance interrupted. Which is why I'm sitting in this chair. The difference between you and me is that I am trying to fix the system. You are trying to protect it, because the system made you $280 million, and fixing it would mean you can't make $280 million more. Vance closed the laptop. He set it aside. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Quieter. Slower. Carrying something heavier than evidence. He was about to tell a story, and the room could feel it. I want to stop talking about numbers for a minute, he said. I want to talk about ice cream. The room shifted. Pelosi's attorney looked up from his notes. April 2020. COVID. The country was locked down. Restaurants closed. Schools closed. 40 million Americans filed for unemployment in 10 weeks. People were lining up in their cars for hours to get boxes of groceries from food banks. In my hometown of Middletown, the food bank ran out twice in 1 month. He paused, and the Speaker of the House went on national television, stood in her kitchen, opened a freezer that costs $24,000, and showed America her collection of high-end ice cream. He didn't show a photo. He didn't need to. Every person listening remembered. We all have our weaknesses, she said. Mine is ice cream. And then she laughed. Vance's voice didn't rise. It dropped. $24,000 for a freezer, while people in her own city, San Francisco, where she's been the representative for 37 years, were losing everything. He opened his notebook. Not the laptop, the leather notebook. Handwritten notes. The kind a man makes when something matters enough to write by hand. I want to tell you about a man named Gary Hendris. He lived 3 houses down from Mama, my grandmother, in Middletown. He was a welder. Retired. 70 years old. Lived alone since his wife died. When COVID hit, Gary couldn't leave his apartment. He didn't have family nearby. He didn't have a computer to order groceries. Vance's voice was steady, but something in it had changed. A crack, almost invisible, that only people who had known real loss would recognize. Gary died alone in his apartment during the lockdown. Nobody found him for 3 days. 3 days. Do you know what was in his fridge when they found him? Half a gallon of milk and a package of bologna? No $24,000 freezer? No high-end ice cream? No vineyard in Napa Valley? He looked at Pelosi. While Gary was dying alone with a half-gallon of milk, your portfolio was growing because you had information. You knew which industries the government would support. You knew which companies would receive emergency contracts. You knew which sectors would be propped up and which would be shut down. And your husband traded on that knowledge while 60-year-old welders in my hometown were dying alone because they couldn't afford to stock a refrigerator. The gallery was motionless. Even the K Street lobbyists had stopped calculating. San Francisco, Vance continued. Your district. The place you've represented for 37 years. 8,000 people sleep on the streets every night. Needles on the sidewalk outside schools. tents lining Market Street for blocks. And you personally own $45 million in real estate in that city? You own a vineyard in Napa? Your net worth is $280 million? He closed the notebook. I grew up poor. Not politician poor. Actually poor. The kind of poor where you know which neighbors have food because you can smell what they're cooking, and you know which nights your mom won't come home because you learned to read the signs. I know what poverty smells like. I know what hunger sounds like when it's your own stomach. And I know in my bones that you don't. Pelosi struck back hard. The hardest she'd hit all day. Mr. Vice President, let me remind you who I am. I passed the Affordable Care Act, the most significant health care legislation in 50 years. 20 million Americans have coverage because of me. I held together a caucus through 2 impeachments and a pandemic. I have raised more money for the Democratic Party than any human being alive. I have done more for working families in one legislative session than you will do in your entire political career. It landed. The gallery felt it. Pelosi's resume was a weapon, and she wielded it like a sword. Vance waited 3 seconds. Then he responded, "You passed the Affordable Care Act, and while you were passing it, your husband was trading healthcare stocks. You impeached a president, and during the impeachment, your portfolio grew. You raised money for your party, and the biggest donors got meetings where legislation was discussed, and then they traded on what they heard." His voice was ice. "Every achievement you just listed, every single one, has a corresponding trade in your husband's portfolio. You didn't pass legislation for America, Madam Speaker. You passed legislation for your brokerage account." Pelosi opened her mouth, closed it. The resume defense, the one that had worked for 37 years, had just been turned inside out. And then Vance brought out the witness. "I'd like to call a witness, Miss Rebecca Chen. She's sitting in the gallery." A woman in her 50s stood up in the 3rd row. Dark suit, no jewelry. The look of someone who had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror for weeks and was still terrified. Pelosi's attorneys erupted. "This is irregular. We were not informed of any witness." Miss Chen was added to the witness list at 8 a.m. "This morning," Vance said. Her statement was provided to the committee and the Minority Council 3 hours ago. Madam Speaker's legal team received a copy at 10 a.m. The chairman, the actual committee chairman who had been deferring to Vance, nodded confirmation. Rebecca Chen walked to the witness table. She was sworn in. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear. "My name is Rebecca Chen. I served as a senior legislative aide in Speaker Pelosi's office from 2011 to 2023, 12 years. She took a breath. "During that time, I observed a pattern. Before major committee votes on legislation affecting specific industries, technology, healthcare, energy, the Speaker would make a phone call from her private office. The calls were always to the same number. I know this because I was sometimes asked to dial it for her. The number belonged to Paul Pelosi. The hearing room was so quiet that the sound of a pen dropping on the press table was audible across the room. After each call, within 24 to 48 hours, public financial disclosures would show trades by Paul Pelosi in the exact industries that were about to be affected by the legislation." She paused. "In 2022, I raised concerns about this pattern to the Speaker's Chief of Staff. I was told to mind my own business. When I raised the concerns again in writing via email, I was terminated. The reason given was restructuring. I was the only person restructured." She swallowed. "After I was fired, I contacted 3 colleagues who I knew had observed the same pattern. All 3 told me to stay quiet. One of them said, and I'll never forget the exact words, 'Rebecca, the Speaker has a long memory and a longer reach. If you talk, she won't come after you. She'll make sure no one in Washington ever hires you again. You'll be invisible. That was 3 years ago. I've been invisible ever since. The gallery stirred. A woman in the press section, a veteran congressional reporter for Politico who had covered Pelosi for 15 years, put down her pen and just listened. She had heard a lot of testimony in her career. This felt different. "Miss Chen," Vance said, "did you keep records of the calls you placed?" "I kept a personal log," Chen said. "Dates, times, duration. I started keeping it in 2019 when I first noticed the pattern. I have 47 entries. Each one corresponds to a call I placed to Paul Pelosi's number at the Speaker's request. And for 39 of those 47 calls, a trade appeared in the public disclosure within 48 hours. 47 calls, 39 trades. The numbers hung in the air like smoke. Pelosi's face had changed. The composure didn't crack. It calcified. She looked like a statue of herself, frozen in a position that no longer meant what it was supposed to mean. "Miss Chen," Vance said, "are you willing to provide your observations under oath to the Department of Justice?" "Yes," she said, "I already have." 3 words. The 3 most devastating words of the hearing. "She's already talked to the DOJ." Someone in the press section whispered. The whisper carried. Pelosi's SEC attorney leaned toward her lead counsel. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. The recognition that the legal math had just changed fundamentally. "Miss Chen, thank you," Vance said. "You may return to your seat." He turned to Pelosi. "You called me unqualified. You said I wasn't fit to carry your briefcase, but your own staff? A woman who worked for you for 12 years, just testified that you called your husband before major votes, and that he traded on what you told him." He paused. "Is she a liar, Madam Speaker? Is she fabricating? Because she's under oath, and the DOJ has her statement." Pelosi's voice came out for the first time without its characteristic control. The pitch was slightly higher, the rhythm slightly faster. The first cracks in 37 years of armor. Miss Chen was a disgruntled employee who was terminated for performance reasons. Her allegations are categorically false, and my attorneys will— "Your attorneys will what?" Vance asked quietly. "Sue a whistleblower on camera in front of the American people? Be my guest." Vance stood. The gesture was unexpected because he hadn't stood once during the entire hearing. He had conducted the most devastating congressional questioning in recent memory while sitting in a chair, typing on a laptop, speaking in a flat Ohio monotone, and now he stood, and the room understood that the final act had begun. He walked to the front of the dais. He didn't bring the laptop. He didn't bring notes. He stood with his hands at his sides, facing Pelosi, and spoke from memory. "I want to put this timeline together because the Madam Speaker is right about one thing. Individual facts can be explained away. It's the pattern that damns." He began. 1,987. You enter Congress. Portfolio, $700,000. Your husband is already a successful investor. Nothing unusual. He took one step forward. 2012. You vote for the Stock Act. 45-day disclosure window, $200 penalty, a law designed to look like reform while protecting the people it pretends to regulate. Another step. 2020. COVID. The country shuts down. People lose their jobs, their homes, their lives. You go on television with a $24,000 freezer full of ice cream and tell America, "We're all in this together." Meanwhile, your portfolio grows because you know what the government is about to do before anyone else. Another step. 2021. 76% of Americans support banning congressional stock trading. You're Speaker of the House. You have the power to bring the bill to the floor. You say, "We are a free market economy." The bill never gets a vote. Another step. He was now standing directly in front of the witness table. 2021 through 2024. NVIDIA, Visa, Microsoft, Tempest AI. 4 trades, 4 perfect outcomes. Your husband's email says, "Nancy says the semiconductor package will clear committee." Your own voice on tape calls insider trading penalties not even a rounding error. Your own aide testifies that you called your husband before every major vote. He stopped walking. 2024. Your portfolio returns 54%. Double the S&P 500. Better than every hedge fund in America. Better than Citadel. Better than Bridgewater. Better than Renaissance Technologies and their army of PhD mathematicians. You, a politician, beat them all. He was close enough to the witness table now that Pelosi had to look up at him. 2025. Your net worth is estimated at $280 million on a salary of $174,000. The president calls you out at the State of the Union. Elizabeth Warren gives a standing ovation. Senator Hawley names the anti-corruption bill after you. He stopped. The timeline was complete. 37 years of suspicion compressed into 60 seconds. You called me a hillbilly. You didn't use the word, but that's what you meant. Too young, too inexperienced, too working class, too much trailer park, not enough Georgetown. His voice was steady, each word placed like a nail. And you know what? You're right. I am a hillbilly. I grew up in a town where the factories closed, the drugs moved in, and the American dream went to die. My mother stuck needles in her arm. My father disappeared. My grandmother raised me on a fixed income and sheer willpower. He paused. But I never stole. I never cheated. I never used my position to enrich my family. I never stood in front of a $24,000 freezer and told struggling Americans that we're all in this together. While my portfolio grew by millions, he looked at the committee, then back at Pelosi. You said I'm not qualified to carry your briefcase. Maybe not, but at least the hillbilly is honest. He paused. At least the hillbilly didn't build a $280 million fortune on the backs of people who trusted him with their government. Pause. At least the hillbilly's grandmother, who never made more than $30,000 a year in her life, never had to explain to a Senate committee why her net worth increased by 40,000% while she was supposed to be working for the public. Pause. At least the hillbilly can look at the people of Middletown, Ohio, the people who lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their futures, and say, I didn't profit from your pain. He looked at Pelosi one final time. Can you say the same to the people of San Francisco? To the 8,000 people sleeping on the streets of the city you've represented for 37 years? Can you look them in the eye and say, your $280 million has nothing to do with the information you had, and they didn't? He paused one final time. The room was so still that the air conditioning sounded like a windstorm. You came into this room today and told me I was unqualified. You told me I wasn't fit to carry your briefcase. You told me you had done more for working families than I ever would. And maybe that's true. Maybe you have passed more bills. Maybe your name is on more legislation. But every single bill you passed, every single one, has a matching trade in your husband's portfolio. The Affordable Care Act, healthcare stocks, the CHIPS Act, semiconductor options, the Inflation Reduction Act, energy plays. You didn't pass legislation for America, Madam Speaker. You passed it for your brokerage account. And the American people, the ones who can't afford lobbyists, can't afford Williams and Connolly, can't afford a $24,000 freezer. They paid the price every single time. He turned to the committee chairman. I'm done with my questions. The silence lasted for seconds. Then the chairman spoke. Based on the evidence presented today, including the subpoenaed email, the audio recording, and the sworn testimony of Ms. Subpoenaed Dollar Rebecca Chen, this committee will formally refer the matter to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation into potential violations of insider trading laws, the Stock Act, and obstruction of congressional oversight. The committee will also formally endorse the pending GAO audit of Representative Pelosi's full trading history. He continued. Furthermore, the committee calls on the full Senate to schedule a floor vote on the Honest Act within 30 days. The American people have waited long enough. The room detonated. Reporters stampeded for the exits. Phones buzzed and rang and vibrated. The K Street lobbyists, the ones who never showed emotion, were standing, some of them texting clients with hands that weren't entirely steady. Camera operators who had been filming wide shots scrambled to find the only two faces that mattered. And Nancy Pelosi, the Queen of Congress, the first female speaker, the woman who had buried more political careers than most people had attended funerals, slammed her palm on the witness table. This is a coup. Her voice cracked like ice breaking on a river. This is nothing but a political coup by a man who called his own president Hitler. She was standing now. Her attorneys were pulling at her arms, whispering urgently, but she shook them off. I have served this country for 37 years. I have built this institution. You think you can destroy me with a laptop and a whistleblower? Her pearl necklace had shifted. Her hair, the hair that cost more than most people's rent, had fallen slightly out of place. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, with fury, the fury of a queen watching her throne burn, and understanding for the first time that no amount of power could put out the fire. A Democratic congressman who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, a man who owed his committee chairmanship to Pelosi, who had raised money for her PAC for 15 years, quietly stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out the side door. He didn't look back. He didn't make a statement. He just left. And 3 people in the press section noticed, and all 3 began typing. Vance stood at the dais. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The image spoke for itself. An 84-year-old woman worth $250 million screaming about a coup, while a 41-year-old from a trailer park in Ohio stood silently with a closed laptop and the evidence that had just ended her career. Her attorneys finally pulled her away from the microphone. One of them was whispering so urgently that his voice was picked up by the mic. Nancy. Nancy. Stop. We're on camera. She stopped. She looked at the camera, and for one moment, a moment that would be replayed millions of times in the days to come, her face showed something that wasn't fury and wasn't composure. It was the naked, uncovered recognition that she had just lost. Not a vote, not a political skirmish, everything. She sat down. She didn't speak again. Vance packed his laptop into his bag. He nodded to the chairman. He walked off the dais without looking back behind him. On the witness table, Nancy Pelosi sat motionless among the wreckage of 37 years. Her attorneys were packing. Her allies had already gone. The K Street lobbyists were already calculating which new power center to align with. The cameras were turning toward the door through which Vance had disappeared. The Queen sat alone, and the throne was burning. The hearing ended at 3:47 p.m. Eastern. By 4, every network on Earth had broken into regular programming. The clip that detonated first was the email. Nancy says the semiconductor package will clear committee. Move on, the NVIDIA calls before the announcement. 14 words that did more damage than 14 years of accusations. Within 90 minutes, it had been viewed 22 million times. The caption people shared it with was always the same: "She's done." The second clip, Vance saying, "I served in Fallujah. I'm not intimidated by a woman with a gavel," became the most shared political soundbite of the year. Within 3 hours, it crossed political lines because it wasn't about policy. It was about the gap between a man who had faced actual danger and a woman who had confused political power with invincibility. The third clip, Pelosi screaming, "This is a coup," with her pearl necklace askew and her attorneys pulling at her arms, was the one that ended her. Not because it showed anger, but because it showed something the public had never seen. Nancy Pelosi out of control. The woman who had maintained composure through impeachments, government shutdowns, and a home invasion that nearly killed her husband, that woman was gone. In her place was someone who looked, for the first time in 37 years, like a person caught. Rebecca Chen's testimony spread differently. It didn't go viral the way the email or the Fallujah line did. It moved through legal channels, journalistic investigations, and congressional offices like groundwater, slowly, invisibly, and unstoppably. By evening, 3 former Pelosi staffers had contacted the Senate committee, offering to corroborate Chen's account. One of them, speaking anonymously to the Washington Post, said, "Rebecca told the truth. We all knew. We just didn't have the courage to say it." The first domino fell at 5:15 p.m. Senator Patty Murray of Washington State, a Democrat, a Pelosi ally of 27 years, released a 2-sentence statement. "The evidence presented today demands a thorough and independent investigation. No one is above the law." 27 years of loyalty dissolved in 2 sentences. By 7 p.m., 11 Democrats had released similar statements. None mentioned Pelosi by name. All mentioned accountability and transparency. Washington code for "save yourself." Elizabeth Warren went further. On MSNBC at 8 p.m., she looked directly into the camera and said, "I have been calling for a stock trading ban for years. What Vice President Vance presented today is exactly why. The evidence is serious. It deserves a serious investigation, and I will co-sponsor the Honest Act when it comes to the floor." A Democrat co-sponsoring a bill championed by the Trump-Vance administration. The political tectonic plates hadn't just shifted. They had shattered. But Warren wasn't the last Democrat to break ranks. Within the hour, Senator John Ossoff of Georgia, a moderate who had carefully avoided criticizing Pelosi for his entire Senate career, posted a single sentence on social media: "Pass the Honest Act." No context, no explanation. Just 4 words that detonated like a grenade in Democratic group chats across Washington. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, which Pelosi had built and nurtured for decades, held an emergency conference call at 9 p.m. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, the caucus released a statement that used the word "disappointing." In progressive politics, disappointing is a death sentence. The revelations today are deeply disappointing and demand full transparency. We support any and all investigations into the matters raised. Deeply disappointing. From her own progressive wing, the woman who had held the Democratic coalition together through 2 impeachments, a pandemic, and an insurrection, couldn't hold it together through 1 hearing with a hillbilly from Ohio. The Honest Act gained 23 new co-sponsors in 48 hours, 14 Republicans and 9 Democrats. The bill was scheduled for floor debate within 2 weeks. Political analysts who had called it dead for years were now calling it inevitable. Pelosi's team issued a statement at 9 p.m. It was drafted by Williams and Connolly, reviewed by the SEC attorney, and approved by 3 additional lawyers who had been retained in the 4 hours since the hearing ended. It categorized the hearing as a politically motivated spectacle and stated that all of Paul Pelosi's trades were lawful, disclosed in compliance with federal requirements, and made independently. It did not address the email. It did not address the audio recording. It did not address Rebecca Chen. The statement convinced exactly no one. Even Pelosi's own staff, reached by reporters throughout the evening, responded with the same phrase, "I'd refer you to the statement," delivered in the flat, exhausted tone of people who knew the statement was insufficient and couldn't say so. At 10 p.m., Fox News reported that the Department of Justice had confirmed receipt of the Senate committee's referral and would review the materials and take appropriate action. The words appropriate action, bureaucratic, colorless, empty to most ears, sent a shock through K Street, because in Washington, when the DOJ confirms it will take appropriate action on the same day evidence is presented, it means the investigation has already begun. The Pelosi Tracker app, the platform that allowed retail investors to copy the Pelosi household's trades, saw downloads surge by 500% overnight. The irony was exquisite. The hearing that exposed the trading made more people want to copy the trades. The market, as always, was more honest than the politicians who regulated it. CNN's Chiron at 11 p.m. read, Pelosi faces DOJ referral after devastating Senate hearing. Fox News led with, The Queen is dead. Vance dismantles Pelosi in historic confrontation. Even MSNBC, after 5 hours of agonized panel discussion, settled on serious questions raised by evidence in stock trading hearing. The word serious from MSNBC meant the same thing as devastating from Fox. It meant the evidence was real, and nobody could spin it away. At midnight, the final number came in. The hearing had been watched live by 4.3 million viewers on C-SPAN, a record. The combined viewership across all platforms, including replays and clips, exceeded 60 million within 24 hours. The Fallujah clip alone accounted for 31 million views. And in Middletown, Ohio, at a VFW hall on Main Street, a 68-year-old retired Marine named Dale Hoskins sat on a bar stool, watching the replay on a television mounted above the bar. He had served in Desert Storm. He hadn't voted in 12 years because he believed, truly, deeply believed, that nobody in Washington gave a damn about people like him. When Vance said, I served in Fallujah, Dale set down his beer. When Vance said, at least the hillbilly is honest, Dale did something he hadn't done for a politician since 2003. He applauded. The bartender looked over. Dale was crying. Not a lot, just enough. The quiet tears of a man who had stopped believing and had just, for one afternoon, started again. JD Vance didn't give an interview. He didn't post on social media. He didn't hold a press conference or appear on any cable news show. He drove to Middletown. The Secret Service detail followed in 2 black SUVs, but Vance had asked them to stay back, not beside the car, not in the car, just behind. He wanted the drive alone. 3 hours from Washington, through the hills of West Virginia, and into the flats of southern Ohio, watching the landscape change from marble monuments to shuttered factories and Dollar General stores. He parked on Gallia Street, in front of a house he used to live in. It wasn't his house anymore. Hadn't been for 20 years. The siding was different. Vinyl now, where it used to be wood. The porch railing was rusted. A kid's bicycle lay on its side in the brown grass of the front yard. He didn't get out of the car. He sat with the engine running and looked at the house where his mother had gotten high in the bathroom, while he pretended to do homework at the kitchen table. The house where Mama had shown up one night with a revolver in her purse and told his mother's boyfriend to get out or get shot. The house where he had learned, at an age when other kids were learning to ride bikes, that the world was not fair and that nobody was coming to save him. He thought about Nancy Pelosi, 84 years old, $280 million, a vineyard, a freezer that cost more than the house he was staring at, 37 years in Congress, and the district she represented had 8,000 people sleeping on the streets. He thought about Gary Hendris, the welder 3 houses down, half a gallon of milk and a package of bologna, dead for 3 days before anyone noticed. He thought about Mama, 19 handguns, 0 stock portfolios, dead with less in the bank than Pelosi spent on ice cream. He thought about the email. Nancy says the semiconductor package will clear committee, 6 million in and 280 million out, on the backs of people who trusted their government to play fair. His phone buzzed. A text from Usha, his wife. "The kids want to know when you're coming home." Yuan said, "You were so cool on TV." His words, "Come home." Vance smiled, put the phone down, looked at the house one more time. Then he drove home. In Washington, in a conference room at Williams and Connolly, 7 lawyers sat around a mahogany table that cost more than JD Vance's first car. They were preparing responses to the DOJ referral, the GAO audit, and subpoenas from 3 congressional committees. The billing rate in the room exceeded $15,000 per hour. Nancy Pelosi was not present. She had gone home. Her staff said she was resting. No one believed it. In San Francisco, on a stretch of sidewalk 6 blocks from a commercial building Nancy Pelosi owned, a man named Marcus Washington pulled a sleeping bag over his shoulders and tried to find a position on the concrete that didn't press against the bruise on his hip. He had been homeless for 4 years. He didn't know who Nancy Pelosi was. He didn't know about the hearing. He didn't know that the woman who had represented his city for 37 years was worth more than he would earn in 9,000 lifetimes. He knew that it was cold. He knew the shelter was full. He knew that tomorrow would be the same as today. In Middletown, Ohio, a 17-year-old girl named Ashley sat cross-legged on her bed in a house that looked a lot like the one JD Vance had just been parked in front of. Her mother was asleep or passed out. Ashley had stopped distinguishing between the two. In the next room, on her phone, Ashley was watching the hearing clip for the 4th time. The part about the grandmother, the 19 handguns, the hospital bill, the part where Vance said he grew up without hot water some nights. She paused the video. She looked around her room at the water stain on the ceiling, at the textbook she'd borrowed from school because she couldn't afford to buy one, at the acceptance letter from Ohio State that was pinned to her wall, the letter she wasn't sure she could afford to say yes to. She pressed play again. She watched the hillbilly from Middletown look the Queen of Congress in the eye and say, "At least the hillbilly is honest." She didn't know it yet, wouldn't know it for years, but something shifted in that moment. Not a decision, not a plan, just a fracture in the wall between what she believed was possible and what she had been told was possible. A crack just wide enough to let light through. In a retirement home in Napa Valley, 12 miles from the Pelosi vineyard, a 91-year-old Korean War veteran named Frank Moretti sat in a wheelchair, watching the hearing replay on a television bolted to the wall. He had worked for the government for 34 years, federal employee, GS-13, retired with a pension of $42,000 a year. His total net worth, after a lifetime of service, was $180,000. He heard the number, 280 million, and he closed his eyes. Not in anger, in exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had played by the rules his entire life, and had just learned at 91 that the rules were for people like him, not people like her. And on a quiet street in a quiet part of Ohio, JD Vance pulled into his driveway. The porch light was on. Through the window, he could see Usha helping Yuan with homework at the kitchen table. Vivek was on the floor with building blocks. Mirabelle was asleep in her mother's arms. He sat in the car for 1 more minute, watching his family through the window. The family he had built from nothing, in a country that had given a kid from a trailer park the chance to stand in the United States Senate and say the thing that needed to be said. He turned off the engine, walked inside, kissed his wife, picked up his son. The hillbilly was home. And somewhere in Washington, in 3 separate government buildings, investigators were opening files, issuing subpoenas, and beginning the slow, methodical work of following the money. $280 million. The hillbilly wanted to know where it came from, and the hillbilly wasn't going to stop asking until he found out.